and the narrative of your life, please welcome Arthur C. Brooks, contributing writer for The Atlantic.
What a delight. Welcome to the Happiness Festival. I'm so happy to be with all of you here and to be in person and to have this beautiful place where we can share these ideas. I am the happiness correspondent for The Atlantic. I teach happiness at Harvard University. What a life. What a beautiful opportunity it is to talk about something that's so important to all of us. I want to tell you very quickly about the genesis of our happiness work at The Atlantic. Thank you. Which started with a conversation that I had with editor-in-chief Jeff Goldberg about 3 years ago, 2.5 years ago at this point. Jeff had been reading my work on The Atlantic. On happiness. We were having lunch in my office. I was running a think tank back in the old days, and he said, why don't you bring your happiness operation in a column over to The Atlantic? And I said, why would I do that? Why would I bring the science of happiness to The Atlantic? And he said, because The Atlantic is not a magazine of punditry and not a magazine of entertainment. It's a magazine of ideas. And the ideas of happiness are the ideas that animate us the most. And that was the beginning of what has culminated now in this. And you are part of the inaugural group of people that are starting what we hope to be a movement that will inspire hope for people all around this country, that will renew the greatness and goodness of our country and be a beacon of light for people around the world. This is not just about feeling good, my friends. This is about doing good with our lives, having meaning for ourselves and for other people. Truly, we see this as a social movement. You and me, all of us together. And all of you who are online joining us, thank you for that. Now, let me tell you briefly about how I became interested in dedicating my life as a social scientist. I'm a nerd with a PhD dedicated to understanding human behavior. And I dedicated it to human happiness, and let me tell you why. 10 years ago, I was a CEO. I had been a college professor for a long time, but then I went to run a large think tank in Washington, D.C. And it was a good life as far as it went. My job was raising $50 million a year in philanthropy. It was giving 175 speeches, traveling around the country. My job was basically like running for the Senate and never getting elected. And 10 years or so, I found myself on an airplane having a little bit of an existential crisis, asking myself, so, friend, I said to myself in my head, what's the end game? Where do you want to wind up? I was 48 years old at the time. Where do you want to be at 58, at 68? More trips, more speeches, more fundraising? Or is there something to it? Are you going in a particular direction? Now, I thought that sooner or later, just ambling on my way, I would find my happiness. Interestingly, as a behavioral social scientist, I'd never answered that question for myself. And what changed the direction of my life that night on a plane from Los Angeles to Washington, D.C., was the conversation that I heard right behind me. See, it was dark, and most people were, drinking on an airplane at night, watching a movie, sleeping perhaps, but not the couple behind me. I could tell by their voices that it was a man and a woman. I could tell by their voices that were quite elderly, and I sort of figured they were married, and you'll see why in a second. Now, the husband was kind of mumbling. I couldn't quite make out his words, but the wife's voice was very penetrating, went right through the seats, and I could hear everything she said. And so I heard the husband said, mumble, 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 and the wife said, oh, don't say it would be better if you were dead. Now they have my full attention. See, as a social scientist, my laboratory is an overheard conversation here and there. Careful what you say behind me, because it might become a book. And then he mumbled some more, and she said, it's not true nobody remembers you. It's not true nobody loves you anymore or will even take your calls. This went on for 20 minutes. He was disconsolate, and she was consoling him. I thought to myself, who is this guy? Look, I'm trained in understanding people, so I thought, this is a person who's not, who is he not? He's not you. He's not somebody who's in charge of his life. He's actually disappointed probably by the opportunities he didn't have, the things he didn't exploit. He probably didn't get the education that he wanted, start the business that he dreamed about. He probably didn't get the promotions, and he didn't have the ambition he should have had. And now he's probably in his late 80s and is near the end. Made sense. Well, an hour later or so, we landed at Dulles Airport in Washington, D.C., and the lights came on, and we all stood up, and I was curious. So I turned around, and it was one of the most famous men in the world, somebody you all know, for his adventures and exploits and heroic acts in the 1960s and 70s. Long time ago. But I thought to myself, I was wrong a minute ago, because I was laboring under a false understanding of the source of happiness. How do you get happy? Here's what the world tells you. Here's what your brain tells you. Do a lot, be successful, achieve, earn, bank it, and enjoy it for the rest of your life. And that, my friends, is wrong. That's just as wrong as making a bunch of money and then hoping it just lasts you for the last 50 years of your life. That's not the way to be happy. That's not even especially the way to be prosperous. We need a better investment strategy than that. And that answered the anxiety I was feeling in my own life. Look, I'm never going to be as great as that man, never as rich, never as famous. But I was going in that direction. And I saw myself at 85 years old explaining to my long-suffering wife, Esther, that I might as well be dead. And she would say, oh, it's not true. What can I do, I said to myself, as a social scientist, how can I build the investment portfolio to avoid that? It was selfish. But it led me on a journey that leads me here to talk to you, fellow strivers, about how we can design our lives so that we can be hope for others and happy for ourselves. That's what I want to talk about. Let me tell you a little bit about the research that ensued and what it taught me and how it's changed my life. Now, I ask my students on the first day of class. I teach at the Harvard Business School, and I teach a class on happiness. And on the first day of class, I say, their average age 27, and I say, 10 years from now, are you going to be happier or unhappier than now? They all say, I'm happier. I say, why? Well, my student loans will be paid off. They say, I'm going to have, I'll have my family situation figured out. I'll probably be in love, and maybe I'll have kids, and family life sounds great. I'm thinking, yeah, just wait. And then they say that I'll be solid in my career and making some good money, and it'll be better. 37 will be better than 27. By the way, they're at the Harvard Business School. They're optimists. They wouldn't be there if they weren't optimists. And I say, okay, now imagine yourself at 47, happier or unhappier? Like, probably even a little happier. I say, okay, now imagine yourself at 77. They're like, I don't want that. I say, how come? They say, well, it doesn't sound fun to be old. They can't come up with anything better than that. And I say, okay, what you're telling me is that you're going to get happier and happier and happier, and then you're going to get unhappier and unhappier and unhappier. They're like, yeah, I guess that's right. I say, okay, let's look at the data. I have data on the average change in happiness over the lifespan for 416,000 citizens in the United States and UK. Now, no sleight of hand here. I have data on India, on China, on sub-Saharan Africa, on Australia, on South America, every place in the world, and it all looks the same every place. And that's what you have in front of you right here, which I show to my students, and they say, oh. Now, this is not as catastrophic as it looks. This is on a 1 to 10 scale, how happy you would assess your life, where 1 is misery and 10 is the happiest person you ever met. And all of the action is on average between 7 and 9. So this is not, 9 to 1. This is just a diminution. What happens? For the average person, happiness tends to decline from early 20s until early 50s. Now, not everybody, like we like to say, I'm an economist after all, your results may vary. But probably not very much. And what do you find is it declines. Why? Well, number one is everybody thinks that circumstances are going to make them happier, and then when they don't, because circumstances don't do it for reasons I'm going to tell you about a little bit later, that it's disappointing. And that's a self-fulfilling prophecy. The second is something physiological that we don't quite understand. There's new research emerging on the neurophysiology of chimps and macaques. And what we find is that they exhibit symptoms of declining mood as they get into middle age. It turns out for a male chimpanzee who's middle-aged, the easiest thing to teach him is how to smoke. Give me something, man. Yeah. But the biggest reason is what we euphemistically refer to as family complications. It turns out that they're, generally speaking, not for everybody, but for a lot of people, there's a bit of a marriage malaise between 20 and 30 years. And it coincides with the scourge of family life, which is commonly known as teenage kids. Now, if you notice the big dip in there, this is 45 to 53 or something, and some of you have, you know what I'm talking about here. When I was doing this research, when I was in my late 40s and early 50s, I had 3 teenagers at the time, 3 teenagers, and my middle son, I was the middle son. It's the middle. If that was, they take up 90% of the family oxygen, but think they're getting 10%, and this is my middle son, Carlos. And Carlos, it was always the same problem. It was this grades problem. So he's failing math. He might not, he's not passing Latin. Latin, I never studied Latin, but you got to pass it. And so if you want to graduate from high school, and I was explaining this again and again, and we were like frequent flyers in the principal's office. And finally, we were at wit's end. And my wife, who's from Barcelona, she's an optimist. She says, think of it this way. At least we know he's not cheating. But then it turns around, because almost everybody starts getting a boost in mood from early to mid-50s until late 60s or even early 70s. This is the renaissance period in most people's lives. Now, there are 2 cases where you don't, which is substance abuse addiction and mental illness. But apart from that, almost everybody gets happier from mid-50s, early 50s until late 60s. And then it looks like it kind of flattens out, and that's the way it's going to be till the end. Now, that's an illusion, it turns out. Let me show you what's really going on in the data. The first part is really right. You decline till about 53, you increase until you're in your late 60s, but then what's really going on is the population breaks up into 2 groups. Half gets happier and happier all the way to the end, and the other half starts all the way back down. Half and half. Okay, you know what I want to be. Top half. Top branch, you too. That's my research, right? Because the guy on the plane was clearly on the bottom branch. Now, he's got to be an outlier after all that success. How can it be possible that somebody so successful would wind up on the lower branch? And it turns out that a lot of them do. Let me introduce you to the work of a married couple of social psychologists at the University of Texas at Austin, Charles and Carol Holohan, who do work on high achievers. They do work on you, fellow strivers. They do work on people who are identified as high-achieving, hard workers, smart, capable early on, and who make the most of it. Now, maybe some of you had a hitch here or there early in your lives. I certainly did. I was invited to pursue my excellence outside of the university in my freshman year in college by the university. At this point, it's sort of dropped out, kicked out, splitting hairs, as I figure. After that, I spent 10 years. My parents called it my gap decade, But the bottom line is we were working hard, and people saw lots of promise in us. It turns out, according to the Holohans, that the people who are identified as the big achievers and who work hard and achieve a lot early in their lives, they're the most likely to be disappointed at their lives in the last decade. Oh, the bitter irony. They tend to be precisely on the lower branch, which is where I was heading and where the man on the plane was. And when you study the biographies of some of the greatest women and men in history, they were there too, because nobody talks about how happy they were in the last decade of their life. Let me introduce you to somebody we all know, Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin is on the list of the 3 greatest scientists of the past 500 years, no matter who you are, because he changed the way that we understand natural life forever. He did so, by the way, at age 27, at the end of a naturalist expedition around the world on a sailing ship called the Beagle. He came back after collecting samples of plants and animals and dropped an intellectual atomic bomb, which was, at age 27, his theory of natural selection, the theory of evolution, which we take for granted today, changed the way everything was seen. He became immediately the most famous, celebrated scientist in all of Europe. Rich, famous. He loved it. Who wouldn't? He dined out on it. But then, 25 years later, book after book, party after party, fortune was made. It all stopped. The party stopped. Because he couldn't continue in his own research because his mathematical abilities could not keep up with his own field. Literally, he needed what we today call genetics, which is a highly mathematical and statistical field, and was being explored in the language of German. And Charles Darwin just didn't have the abilities. And so his progress stopped. He spent the last 20 years of his life complaining to his friends that he was disappointed at his own success. He wrote this a year before he died. I'm rather despondent about myself. I have not the heart or strength at my age to begin any investigation lasting years, which is the only thing which I enjoy. He could have been the man on the plane. We remember him as a great hero. He was buried at Westminster Abbey as a hero, and he died feeling himself a disappointment because he was a case study. He was on the lower branch. Now, I have studied, as an economist, people who waste their gains early in life. And here's the bottom line. If you're really, really successful early on in life, good for you. Get a 401k. Save your money, for Pete's sake. But you know what? There's no 401k for happiness. And that's what we need as well. This is where the research took me. The happiness 401k plan. And I want to tell you about the 3 things that the people who have cracked this code, who are successful in their lives and happy in their lives at the end, the things that they did. This is the happiness retirement plan. Investment 1. Actually, here's 3. Get on your second curve of life. Stop adding to your life and start taking things away. And finally, tend to your roots. Let me tell you what I mean by these things. Now, a lot of this is this new book that I'm talking about called From Strength to Strength, which is an ancient Jewish blessing from the 84th Psalm. Michael el Chael, may you go from strength to strength, which is exactly what the man on the plane would have wished for and which we all want for ourselves and for others. How do you do it? With this plan. And it starts by getting on your second curve. Now, here's the problem that the man on the plane had, that Darwin had, that a lot of people had. They have what we call the striver's curse. The striver's curse is the phenomenon in which you get better and better and better at doing what you're doing all the way through your 20s and 30s. Why? Because of a phenomenon called fluid intelligence. Fluid intelligence is your innovative capacity, your working memory, your indefatigable energy, your ability to focus, laser-like, and you know what it's like. Where, you're the star litigator, you're the financial professional, you're good at the accounting firm, you're better and better as a surgeon. You do your thing. I don't care if you're an electrician or a bus driver or whatever you do, with fluid intelligence and 10,000 hours, you can excel and be noticed as a result, and it's fun. Here's the problem. Fluid intelligence, according to social psychologists, and according to the structure of the prefrontal cortex of the brain, increases through your 20s and 30s with effort, but it peaks, usually between the late 30s and early 40s, and then it starts to decline. What used to be easy becomes hard. What used to be hard becomes a little bit impossible, and in any case, it's less fun. It's a weird thing, you know what this feels like in your mid-40s where you're like, I used to like it more, and I like it less now. It feels like burnout, maybe. It feels like losing focus. You know this feeling? I sure do. I remember this. And, this is when your 45-year-old hotshot dentist starts taking Fridays off. It's like, why are you taking Fridays off? It's like, I don't know. It's just, What's going on is that your dentist is not getting better as a dentist anymore and suddenly finds that she likes it less. This happens to all of us. This is natural. This is the structure of the brain. And if this is all there is in life, and you ride this curve all the way down and feel aggrieved about your past successes, woe be unto you. This is Charles Darwin. This is the man on the plane. This is the striver's curse that we find from the burden of high achievement early. Now, the man who studied this phenomenon is the social psychologist. By the way, here's fluid intelligence, right? Interesting, because he's a little bit older than 20s and 30s at this point. But the complex problem solving and working memory. This fluid intelligence was first identified by this man, Raymond Cattell, the social psychologist from Great Britain, who started to write about this early in the 1950s and really developed his theories of this in the 1960s and 1970s. But here's the interesting thing. Sure enough, he showed, is falling like a rock in your 50s. But that's not where his story finished, because that's not the only kind of intelligence. Here's the thing that the striver's curse misses, and the frustrated people in the last decades of their life miss. There's a second curve behind it. There's another kind of intelligence that comes later, if you look for it and you develop it, which is called crystallized intelligence. The first was your Elon Musk curve. The second is your Dalai Lama curve. And what do we know about this crystallized intelligence, according to Raymond Cattell and much subsequent research that has followed this sense? It's not about your working memory and your ability to solve problems quickly. Any problem you can solve quickly. It's about the ability to answer the question, is this problem worth solving? It's your wisdom curve, your accumulated knowledge and experience, your wisdom, your judgment, your teaching ability, your ability to recognize patterns, and it increases with age. Have you noticed, if you're anything around my age, that early on you were able to crack any case, you could figure things out, and now you can explain anything? You're weirdly a better mentor than you used to be. Why is it that at my university, at Harvard University, uniformly the best teaching evaluations go to professors over 70? Is it pity on the part of the students? They have no pity. It is because teaching ability is about crystallized intelligence. Weirdly, when I first finished my PhD, I was writing papers that were so mathematically complex that I can't read them today. And yet today, the corpus of what I do as a research social scientist is to write a column for The Atlantic for 300,000 people a week. These are not specialists. These are not academics. They're us, people who are simply looking for the secrets of happiness, and they want it based in neuroscience, and they want it based in social science, but they want it written in a way that they can understand. I am teaching in The Atlantic every Thursday morning. What a privilege it is, because I am sitting on my crystallized intelligence curve. Let me show you what these curves look like. Fluid intelligence increases through your 20s and 30s and starts to decline. Your crystallized intelligence is backfilling it if you know where to look. It's increasing, and it crosses sometime in your mid-40s, if you're like most people. Again, there's variance on this, but this is generally speaking the way it works, and it stays high through your 50s and 60s and 70s. Why is it that America's greatest historian, until very recently, David McCullough, was writing his best books in his mid-80s? The reason is because the data show that crystallized intelligence, generally speaking, is peaking at about age 65. And the better quality of your work is in the second half after 65. If you're a historian, if you're a professor, take care of your health, because you're going to do your best work in your 80s if you really sit on this crystallized intelligence curve. Now, what does crystallized intelligence mean for you? I'm literally a professor, but it means something else for you, because you have the professor in you in some way. You have the team leader. Maybe you are a startup entrepreneur. The crystallized intelligence is the venture capitalist. Maybe you are the star litigator. The crystallized intelligence is the managing partner. Maybe you are the data scientist. Now you're leading the team. Find your crystallized intelligence. Get on your second curve. Early on, rely on fluid. Then later, rely on crystallized and focus on instruction. Are you doing that? That's investment one. Investment two. 5 years ago, I was in Taiwan. I was doing a lot of work in Taiwan at the time, and I was visiting the National Palace Museum, which is the world's the greatest exhibition of Chinese art and artifacts from 8,000 years ago into the present. Now, I know well enough when you visit something as vast as any museum like along these lines, that if you don't go with a guide and you don't spend a little bit of time learning about just a few things, you'll walk through pots and prints, and the only thing you'll remember later on is the snack bar. So I got myself a guide, a philosopher actually, who is well-versed in the philosophy of art, both East and West. I was looking at an enormous jade structure, a carving of a Chinese village. Beautiful, green, shiny, incredible. And I said, why is it that even if I knew nothing about this, I would know it's Chinese? And he said, here's the answer. Answer this question and you'll know. He's very elliptical in this way. He was a philosopher, after all. He said, what do you think of when I say a work of art yet to be started? And I said, I don't know, an empty canvas? He said, right. You know what we think of art that is not there yet to be completed? And I said, what? He said, a piece of jade that has what you're looking for already inside it. You think of art as starting from nothing, and the culmination of the brush strokes creates the art. We think of art as already being created inside the block of wood or jade or marble or stone, and then we simply need to take away the parts that are not that sculpture. Michelangelo said that one time. The Chinese artists live this. He said, this actually explains a whole lot about the Western lifestyle. I said, what do you mean? He said that sometime around your mid-40s, with that canvas, it's starting to get a little bit full. I thought to myself, at that time, you know what my life looks like? That. By the way, that's Jackson Pollock, and that just sold for $30 million. But here's the point. You add a brushstroke to this, it doesn't get better. After a certain point in your life, it's done, and it's done a lot sooner than you think. This is the reason that people say, I don't know, I just want something. I'm not satisfied. Maybe I'll get a boat. Just another brushstroke. What do you need? What do the happiest people later in life, what do people on their second curve do? They change the metaphor. They start chipping away. They started with adding, and then they start chipping away. Because this is where you want to end up. And you don't get that by adding. You only get that by taking away. Sometime in the middle of your life, you need to go from the canvas to the jade. So here's the question. Let me give you one more thing to look at here. Here's the idea, in maybe slightly more Western terms, that my MBA students like. You think that to find satisfaction in your life, you got to add more. You got to have more haves. You got to have what you want. But that's the wrong model. So here's the right model of satisfaction. It's what you have divided by what you want. I've been working for the last 10 years closely with His Holiness the Dalai Lama. And he told me when he was speaking to my students, he was the guest speaker in my MBA class. He and by Zoom, even the Dalai Lama is on Zoom. He was speaking to my students and 14 million people around the world. And I asked him, Your Holiness, what is the secret to lasting and stable satisfaction? And he said, not to have what you want, but to want what you have. Your satisfaction is what you have divided by what you want. The secret is not to have more in the second half of your life. The secret in the second half of your life is to want less. This is what you're looking for. This is the Yungan grottos in Western China. In 453 BC, it was completed at the end of 70 years at the work of 10,000 stone-cutting artisans. It's 7 stories tall. It took millions of years to build up the mountain that that's in, and it took the great effort of true artists to chip away the mountain to find that within. Your job, in the second half of your life in particular, is to find that within the mountain that you have built. Investment 2. Early on, add. Later on, subtract. What do you need to subtract this year? Make it your project. This year on your birthday, throw out your bucket list and make a reverse bucket list. All the attachments you want to shed. And finally, your journey is a solitary one as a striver. I talk to people all the time. I quoted the 84th Psalm early on. He goes from strength to strength. But this first psalm really talks about, and this is the word where King David is creating an elegy for the righteous man. The righteous man is like a tree planted by streams of water, yielding its fruit in season, whose leaf does not wither, and who prospers in all that he does. This is great. This is wonderful. It's solace for others, but it's a solitary existence, to be sure. I was reading this and thinking about this when I was in Aspen, Colorado, where I met some of you. And I was looking at the beautiful aspen tree, thinking the stately aspen, solitary, sometimes perhaps even lonely, the price of being successful. But then a friend of mine who's more sophisticated in botany than I am said, that's actually a terrible metaphor. And I said, why? He says, because the aspen tree is not a plant. I said, yes, it is. He said, it's not a single plant. The aspen tree is actually one plant across an entire stand. And he told me about this. The world's largest living organism is a stand of aspens that's 106 acres, 6 million kilograms of wood in Utah. That's one plant, one single organism. Every seemingly solitary tree is one shoot coming out from the same root system. Here's my point, my friends. If you are a striver, you will tend to think of yourself as an individual. That is an illusion. You are not a single individual. All of you here today and me, we are part of the same root system. Do you want to grow older and be happier? Do you want to be on the upper branch of your own tree? Then you need to cultivate not the leaves, not this individual shoot. You need to cultivate your root system, which is what all happy people do, and what all strivers, what many strivers, what they forget. Don't go it alone. Your true self, not the sum of your achievements. Your true self, the reality of yourself, is the sum of the love for the people in your life. Who did this right? Who did these three things? I told you about Darwin, but I got to give you a better example than that. It was this man. I made my living as a musician for many years, from when I was 19 until I was 31 years old, as a French horn player, many of those years in the Barcelona Symphony. And my favorite composer was Johann Sebastian Bach. Johann Sebastian Bach was just like Darwin. He was the toast of his generation, the most innovative mind of the high Baroque. The money and the glory and the commissions poured in from princes and royalty, the toast of the town. But at age 50, his progress stopped. He didn't know he had come to the end of his fluid intelligence, but he did, because he was overtaken by a style of music, the classical style of music, that rendered the high Baroque as anachronistic as we think of disco is today. Ironically, it was ushered in by his own son, the new style, Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach. His own son supplanted him as the greatest composer of the generation. Now, Bach could have been like Darwin, trying to live the past, aggrieved about his lost glory, but no, that's not what Darwin did. That's not what Bach did. Bach recrafted his career as the greatest composer of his generation, who was a teacher. He dedicated himself to teaching the organ, to teaching composition, to teaching the chorus, less sexy, less rich, less glorious, but happier, because he was serving other people. He was truly on his crystallized intelligence curve, and the older he got, the happier he got. Bach died happy. Here's what was happening in the moment of Bach's death. He was literally writing a textbook for his students to memorialize the greatest techniques of the high Baroque, probably never really to be played, just to be understood. Now, that work was dusted off 100 years after his death by a composer named Felix Mendelssohn, who said, "This is the most beautiful thing I've ever heard," and resurrected it as the kind of music that we know and enjoy today. But he did not know that. He was dedicating himself to cultivating the beauty and potential of other people. He was serving those around him. He was getting on his upper branch. Bach is the sine qua non of happiness excellence, by understanding that second curve. And what I want to do now is I want to show you, I want to demonstrate for you literally the piece that he was writing when he put down his pen and died. This was a textbook so beautiful, it's played in concert today. Imagine reading a textbook that's read as literature. That's what Bach was doing, but not for his own glory, but rather for the good of others. This is the Contrapunctus number 3 of Johann Sebastian Bach, which he wrote as he lay dying. May you be Bach and not Darwin. May you go from strength to strength. Thank you.